So our next speaker is Adam Harwood. Adam is a capabilities lead at Ultraleap. He describes himself as an XR geek and a general all-round nerd. He joined Ultraleap, he was employee number 24, and there are now 150 employees working over multiple time zones. He enjoys thinking about and discovering the potential of new technologies, and when asked to describe himself in 5 words, he went with curious, kind, optimistic, logical, and ambitious. This is his first time talking at Bristech, and his talk today is entitled Spatial Interaction in XR. Please join me in welcoming Adam.
Thank you. So I want to start with a question so I can kind of understand what kind of knowledge level we're already at. Who's expecting a talk on Extinction Rebellion? Hands up. Sorry, you're going to be sorely disappointed. But by the end of this talk, hopefully we'll all know what I mean by spatial interaction and XR, and you'll know everything you need to actually get started working with it. So can we switch to my slides, please? Thank you. So we'll start with some definitions and then look at the hardware that you can use and how to set that up. We'll look at the limitations and the capabilities of the technology, and then some best practice, some do's and don'ts, followed by some additional tech that you can use to really take it to the next level. But first, a little bit about me. I studied computer science at the University of Bristol, just at the top of the hill. I spent a couple of years as a full-stack web developer, but I wasn't very good at it. So I taught myself Unity and joined Ultrahaptics as a demo developer. This was in 2016. This was just when the first lot of the most recent generation of VR headsets was coming out, so the Oculus Rift, the HTC Vive, PSVR, and also the Microsoft HoloLens. So I was working with it kind of from the beginning of this wave. Now I am capabilities lead at Ultraleap, which is the company that formed from the merging of Ultrahaptics and Leap Motion earlier this year. So my job is to try and expand the capabilities of the tech to figure out what we can do with it, and also what we can't. But anyway, enough about me. What is spatial interaction? Well, I thought the quickest way to explain it would be to Google it for you. Unfortunately, it seems that geography have already grabbed this term, so it's not that. Again, apologies if you were hoping for a talk on geography. So in this context, interaction means interfacing with a computer. So providing input, getting output. Generally, just using a computer, so human-computer interaction. This can be in any context, from gaming to productivity to communication. I'm not talking about anything specific here. And the spatial part means that we're doing it in space. Okay, so maybe not this kind of space, but just the space all around us. And the key thing is it's 3D space, not 2D. So it's not like with a touchscreen or a mouse or a trackpad. But really the idea is trying to use our hands to interact with the virtual world in the same way as the real one. And this is a great idea because it's much more natural and intuitive than our current modes of interaction. We learn from birth to use our hands and to interact with the real world. And if we can take those modalities, those affordances, and take them into the virtual world, it'll be much easier for everyone. So what is XR? Typically, this means extended reality. So it means virtual reality, augmented reality, or mixed reality headsets, like this HoloLens that I am modeling this incredibly cheesy photo. So I'm not talking about mobile phone AR, like Pokemon Go, for instance. This is specifically the head-mounted variety. So you might be thinking, well, what about controllers or gloves? You can use these with XR, and you can use them to interact in 3D. And that's true. And they both have their place. If you're developing a hardcore VR game, please do use the controllers. The multiple buttons will make it great to do the different actions, and they're a lot more precise than other modalities, other input methods. There's also gloves like Haptics or Dexmo. These are a lot rarer at this point. They're still earlier stage of development, but they still have their place if you want to develop some kind of training simulator or something that is fairly specific. But I wanted to keep this talk fairly general and talk about stuff that you can use with any kind of headset. And also this idea of interacting with the virtual world in the same way as the real one. So I'm talking about bare hands and usually in mid-air. So if you're going to interact with your computer with your bare hands, your computer needs to know where your hands are. So you need some kind of hand tracking. This is the key enabling tech for spatial interaction. You need it. Some headsets already have this built in. So for instance, the Magic Leap has some hand tracking. The VRgineer's X-Tool already has it. And there's a lot more coming up that have it. The industry has started to realize it's really important. So the HoloLens 2 will have it built in when that's released. The Vario VR2 Pro will have that when it's released, and the Oculus Quest is getting a software update next year that will enable hand tracking. If your headset doesn't have hand tracking, or if it's not good enough for whatever reason, you can get peripherals to enable this. These are usually under £100, and you can buy them online, so they're pretty accessible. So you get things like Fingo, Manomotion, and the one that we at Ultraleap produce, which is called Leap Motion. And there are others as well. If you're using a peripheral, there are a couple of extra steps that you have to take before you can actually get started. So the first thing you have to do is actually mount it on the headset. There's a few ways of doing this. My favorite is double-sided sticky tape. But of course, being engineers, we would use duct tape. So this is the Leap Motion peripheral mounted on an old Oculus headset. You can also use blue tack, or I saw someone use elastic bands. And most of these peripherals, you can also buy developer mounts with them, which is usually just an adhesive with a piece of plastic that you can use to slot the peripheral into. And you can also usually get the STL files if you want to 3D print them yourself. And there's also a whole community of people out there who design these 3D printed mounts, like this one for the original HoloLens. The red bit is the mount that's been 3D printed here. If you want to go into production, then you're probably going to want a better solution than this, but you can include it in your industrial design. There's a company called The Void who have done this. They've got a piece that slots onto the front of the headset, which contains the peripheral, and it looks as if it's all just one unit. So once you've mounted your peripheral, you then need to calibrate it. This is really important, especially in VR, because otherwise it'll mess with your sense of proprioception. So this is a sense of where our body is in space. And if you can imagine, if I'm wearing a VR headset and I put my hand in front of me, but it shows my hand as if it's over here, I know something's wrong. So this is where calibration comes in. And with AR as well, things won't line up. Usually this involves tweaking the position and rotation of the tracker in relation to the headset. So if you're using Unity or Unreal, it's just a matter of updating the transform. And there are a few ways of doing it. You can do it by hand, as it were. So if you're in VR, you render the hand, you hold your hand out, tweak the values until it kind of feels like it lines up. You can also flip up the headset to just check. In AR, it's even easier. Again, you render the hand, you can see your hand, and you can see if they line up or not. Usually this doesn't actually have to be perfect. The human sense of proprioception is not really spot on. If it can be off by a few centimeters, people won't actually notice, which makes it very easy to get started. If you want a bit more accuracy, you can use a ruler and a protractor to kind of measure the offset and the angle, and then you put the values in. If you don't have a protractor to hand, you can get them on your phone these days. If you've got industrial design, then you can just read the values out of your CAD data. And if you're using Unity and Leap Motion, then you'll get a UI like that, and then you can see that's where we're putting the values in. So, as an engineer, I always want to know what are the limitations of a technology that I'm using? What can't I do, as well as what I can do? And all hand tracking solutions have limitations. The first to be aware of is the field of view. So almost all hand tracking solutions are optical, whether that's infrared or visible light. There's a camera involved, and cameras have a field of view. The general rule is if it can't see it, it can't track it. So in this case, the field of view of the peripheral is 135 degrees. It's kind of coming out the headset like this. That means that if my hands are here, they can be tracked. If they're here, they can't. Simple as that. So it's really important to be aware of the field of view and design your interactions so that they all sit within it. Little tip, if you are using a peripheral, you can angle it slightly downwards or move it towards the bottom of the headset. This is because the field of view that's coming out of the peripheral on the vertical is something like this. But we very rarely put our hands up here, and we very often put our hands down here. So you can kind of choose where you want that region of hand tracking to be. And it doesn't have to be much, maybe just 10 degrees or so. Also, occlusion is something to be aware of. Again, if you can't see it, you can't track it. If I place one of my hands behind the other, I can't see the hand that's behind, and if I was an optical hand tracker, I wouldn't be able to track it. Different systems handle this differently, some better or worse. But typically, in all cases, if the hand is occluded for any amount of time, more than a second or two, it's going to lose tracking. The tracker is just going to say, okay, I don't know, there's a hand there. Just going to pretend there's not. Some will handle it fairly well if it's a fairly fleeting occlusion. So you've got to try and design your interactions so that this doesn't happen too much. So don't design any interactions where the user is going to move their hand in front of the other and hold it there for any length of time. Hands are one of the most awkward things to track because not only can they be occluded by other things, they also occlude themselves. This is typical when you're trying to do grabs or grasps or pinches. And in this case, where I'm pinching, if it weren't for my sense of touch, I wouldn't know where my fingers are. I can't see the tips of either of my finger or my thumb. So if you are going to have a pinch interaction, make sure you train your users to do it in a way that the hand tracker can actually see the fingers and not like this. Hands can also be occluded by objects if you're holding props or the world around you. Typically, hand trackers work by recognizing fingers. They're the most recognizable parts of the hand. So if you are holding an object, and this won't work in all cases, again, different hand trackers vary, but try and make sure that the fingers are visible. You're far more likely to be able to achieve hand tracking if the tracker can see the fingers. Also, again, fast movements. If it can't see it, it can't track it. It's an optical system. It varies by system. Some will handle fast movements better than others. But if you're constantly waving your hands around, it's going to lose them. But with some systems, maybe the odd fast movement will be okay. Again, design your interactions so that this isn't happening. The accuracy and precision of tracking systems also varies, but even the very best are not going to be spot on all the time. Usually, they're okay, unless you're doing some very, very fine movements, like watchmaking, you might struggle with, but most of the time, it's fine. So, now we know what we can't do, let's look at what we can do. So the first thing that you'll normally do with any hand tracking system is drive a rigged graphical model. You'll have had to do this already if you were calibrating a peripheral. And I want to point out that seeing your hands in VR is really special. I've watched hundreds of people see their hands in VR for the first time, and they all look at them as if they've never seen their hands before. I saw it happening just out there. There's a demo. Using a Vive. It happens all the time, and it is special. It's really important for the sense of immersion, the sense of feeling that you're actually there, that your whole body is actually there. In augmented reality, when you can see through the headset, it's arguably even more important because you can do occlusion. So if I have a virtual object sat on this table in front of me, and I pass my hand in front of it, I shouldn't be able to see the bits of the object that my hand is in front. It sounds obvious, right? But AR systems that don't have hand tracking can't do this. So they would actually render the object over my hand, which almost makes it seem like it's suddenly jumped to in front of my hand. It completely breaks the sense that the object is actually there in the real world. So with hand tracking, it's actually really easy to do occlusion. With every AR system I've come across, it will interpret a black pixel as meaning let the user see through the headset. So if it's black, it's actually just transparent, which means you can just take a hand model like this, render it with a flat black material, and you've got occlusion for free. But it's not just physics, it's not just graphics models you can drive, it's also physics. You'll recognize if you've used Unity, these are colliders. And the hands are modeled as kinematic rigid bodies with capsule colliders for each of the fingers, and there's a cuboid for the palm. Again, this varies by system, but most of them will do something like this. This opens up a lot of possibilities, and I will come back to this later. Really, the bread and butter of hand tracking is being able to query position and orientation of points on the hand. This is what every hand tracking system will enable you to do. They won't all necessarily let you query as many points as this, but you usually get the key points of fingertips, palm, and wrist. We're working currently with the Kronos group to define the OpenXR standard, which has an extension for hand tracking, which will standardize this and make it much easier to work across multiple different hand tracking systems. And once you can query these points on the hand, you can start to detect poses. So for instance, pinch. In fact, Oculus have built their entire UI around the pinch gesture. And it's really easy. Here's some C# code that I wrote to detect it. So I'm just taking the position of the tip of the index finger, the position of the tip of the thumb, and taking the Euclidean distance between them. If it's less than a centimeter, then I've got a pinch. Nice and simple. You can also detect other poses, obviously, by looking at the relative positions of other points on the hand. So, we now know what we can do, what we can't do, but what should we do and what shouldn't we do? So the first thing you might be thinking, now that you know about this ability to track the points on the hand, is that we could add gestures to everything. So maybe I could make a media player, and I could have a swipe right for next song, swipe left for previous song, maybe a tap gesture for play and pause, or I could maybe raise the volume like this. Please don't do that. Gestures usually actually make things worse. There are a bunch of reasons, both UX and technical, for this. And there's this great quote from Hitchhikers. All you had to do was wave your hand in the general direction of the components and hope. It saved a lot of muscular expenditure, of course, but meant that you had to sit infuriatingly still if you wanted to keep listening to the same program. This is about a gesture-controlled radio. Actually, it was written a while ago, but it's not far off. So one reason not to use gestures is that every gesture, you need to train the user. And as we've seen with the pinch, it's actually hard to do that right. And they may not be as intuitive as you think. There have been studies done where they will sit someone in a room and say, do the gesture that you'd like to do to be able to turn on the TV. And different people do different gestures. And it varies by culture. So you can't just choose a single best gesture for any given scenario. Another thing is they can be quite hard to explain. If I say to someone, do a tap gesture, and I have many times, some people will do this. Some people will do this. Some people will do this. If you're thinking about the points on the hand that you are tracking, there's no single thing that you can track there that will detect all three of those gestures. So they might all be tap, but they're also actually different gestures, which makes it quite difficult for us as engineers to design systems that will actually recognize them. You've maybe got to gather a lot of data, throw some machine learning at it. But even then you'll have a problem. If you want to be able to recognize multiple gestures, you're going to get confusion between them. You're going to get false positives and false negatives. There's a question of when does a gesture start and end. Take that media player example. Say I want to go previous through a bunch of songs, and I'm sort of swiping through them. Now imagine what the computer is seeing. I'm just flapping my hand around. Did I mean to go previous or next? It doesn't know. So the general rule with gestures is if you absolutely must use them, just use one. Don't try and put multiple gestures in. People are going to forget them. The computer's going to get them mixed up. Stick to the one. And the pinch is quite a good one for this. It's fairly easy to remember, and it's quite easy to detect. Obviously, there's the self-occlusion problem, so there's still a bit of training involved, but you can usually work around that. So if we shouldn't use gestures, what's the alternative? Well, if I want to move this glass in the real world, I don't go, no, I move it with my hand. And that's what we want to be able to do in the virtual world. So if we can have affordances for virtual objects that are similar to real objects, then people will already know how to use them. You can also start to give people superpowers or magic powers. You're a bit careful here, but if I'm in the virtual world and there's an object the other side of the room, do I really want to make my user have to walk all the way over there when it's a computer? It could just come to them. There's still more work to be done there to figure out how to do that well, and so that people will actually get that. But I think the key is it needs to be rooted in real-world experiences. So if you've been thinking about picking up objects, then you might have noticed a problem. So I want you to imagine how your favorite physics engine will handle this case. We've got two kinematic rigid bodies either side moving inwards, and we've got a non-kinematic rigid body in the center. And you might have realized this is the exact same situation as trying to pick up an object with these as the fingers. So of course, what's going to happen is it's going to move away. And this is like me trying to pick something up and it just sliding. And this is exactly what the physics engine is supposed to do. And of course, if I move my fingers in fast enough or far enough, it's just going to go flying off into infinity. So physics engines are designed to prevent penetration between rigid bodies, and they will apply a force to any non-kinematic rigid body to make that happen. And this is good most of the time. This is what you want. The problem is that with hands, it doesn't really work. And we shouldn't really be modeling hands as soft bodies. That would be really expensive and also wouldn't actually solve the problem entirely. There are other problems. So for instance, if I'm grasping an object, I kind of want most of physics to be disabled, and I want it to sit in the hand in a natural manner. If I have an object on a table and I push down through it, in the real world I can't do that, it stops me. But in the virtual world there's nothing to stop my hand. So what should happen to the virtual object? Unfortunately, this isn't an entirely solved problem. It does vary by vendor. If you're using Leap Motion, there's a module called the Interaction Engine, which does solve these problems for you in Unity and Unreal. If you're using the Microsoft Mixed Reality Toolkit, there's manipulation handlers, they call them. So these aren't quite physics, but they do allow you to do things like pick up an object, rotate it, scale it, and so on. And the other option is, if you are interested in physics, make your own. It's a tough problem. I want to show you a short video clip of what this looks like when it's done right. Ooh. Let's try that again. Third time's a charm. Oh, never. for that. You might have seen that we broke some of the rules there. There was more than one gesture. There we go. So there's some other things that we can do. Make UI 3D. When we first started seeing XR interfaces come out, everyone just took the touchscreen or web interfaces that they'd already developed and they slapped them on a plane in 3D space and said, we're done. This is, you can do this. And there's a screenshot I took last week of SteamVR, still doing it. And it's okay, but it's missing a lot of the opportunity. So in XR, we can deliver separate images to both eyes, and almost all headsets have 6 degrees of freedom tracking. This is proper 3D, so use it. Things are starting to get better. If there are some games like Job Simulator and Rec Room, which do have 3D UIs, and they're a lot better to use most of the time. Again, it's getting the affordances to be more like the real world, so people know how to use them already. There's still more work to be done here, but I would expect that the best UIs we see in XR in the future are going to be 3D. Let's talk about ergonomics. Who's seen Minority Report? Okay. If you haven't, I would recommend it. It's a great film. And there's these scenes where they use this computer UI and they, with these 3-fingered gloves, and they do movements like this, and it looks amazing. And it's inspired a bunch of UIs, both fictional and real. But there is a problem here. Look at his elbows. Now imagine holding your elbows up like that for any length of time. In fact, if you do exercises, you'll often have to do this kind of thing. It's really hard, it's really tiring. You'll get fatigued really quickly. So please, let users keep their arms by their sides, or at least their elbows. The forearms, actually, you can do quite a lot without getting fatigued. But really, the elbows need to be resting either on a surface or by the side. It's okay to make the user occasionally have to reach up, but if you're going to build a UI, try to keep the frequently used things down within reach. There's also an opportunity here around ergonomics to design UIs that will solve some of the problems that we've seen over the last 50 years of using computers. So keyboards often cause RSI, and we see a lot of problem with back pain. Obviously, we've seen weirdly shaped keyboards and standing desks as a potential solution to this. But within XR, we have the ability to redefine the interactions that people are doing and the way they are moving their hands and their bodies. And I think there's a lot of potential here to actually design UIs that will solve some of these problems. But there's more work to be done here. So, haptics. This is the tech I mentioned that can really enhance the experience. So, hands, for us as humans, are not just output devices. We don't just use them to manipulate the world around us. We also use them to sense. So haptic feedback is all about the sense of touch. And it improves the experiences dramatically. I really can't overstate how important it is. It improves the sense of presence and immersion, and it just makes the whole thing more emotional as well. You might have come across haptics in game controllers like rumble packs, and your phones, obviously the vibrate function. And those are great examples of Vibrotactile feedback. But the sense of touch is actually many senses. I mentioned proprioception earlier. There's Vibrotactile, which is vibrations. Resistance, so these are forces acting against the hand. Thermal, hot and cold. And there are others as well, like pain, but I'm not going to talk about that one. Unfortunately, with haptics, there's no neat solution that you can buy on Amazon for 80 quid. The technology is earlier stage. Some of it is very much R&D. There are some commercial solutions. So let's start with resistive feedback. So in physics, a force is any interaction that, when unopposed, will change the motion of an object. Or, much easier, force can be described intuitively as a push or a pull. So now we have a problem, because most of the time our hands are in midair. So if we want to push or pull the hands, we don't have any object to apply a force to the hand other than the air itself. So if I wanted to blow air hard enough to push my hand or even just impede my hand, that air would have to be moving very quickly, which probably isn't safe. Maybe if you want to pull the hand, you could use some kind of vacuum, maybe get out your vacuum cleaner and try and use that. I'd never tried that, don't know if it would work. So unfortunately, there's no good options here. You need to be holding something, or you need to be in contact with something, really, to apply resistive feedback, a push or a pull. So sorry about that one. Vibrotactile. Here there are a few more options. This is all about vibrations in the skin. And you can get some wearables, so smartwatches and vibrating bracelets are a nice portable solution. Problem is that they can only apply a limited set of sensations to your hand. They're not very targeted. But they might be all right if you just want to be able to notify someone or alert them or whatever. If you don't need it to be portable, if you're developing something that's location-based, then you've got a lot more options. You can use fans if you want a fairly kind of broad spectrum air blowing at you. Air vortices, again, have been used. Or the other option is ultrasound. So this is a solution that we develop at Ultraleap. It's called Ultrahaptics, and it uses ultrasound to vibrate the surface of the skin. It's quite a good solution. It works, and I would recommend trying it if you haven't. It's quite hard to describe what it feels like. It's much easier to feel it for yourself. However, this is fairly new tech, and it's still quite expensive. We're driving down the price as fast as we can, but it's nowhere near as cheap as consumer VR or hand tracking hardware. In terms of thermal feedback, you've got some options here as well. You can produce warmth with heaters or with heat lamps. If you want to focus that warmth to try and stimulate a smaller area of the skin, you can use a funnel or a vortex for a heater, or you can use a focusing lens for a heat lamp. And I've seen this done where they just used a Fresnel lens to focus it to about a centimetre diameter point on the hand to provide very targeted feedback. Cooling is a little bit harder. Unfortunately, there's no such thing as a cold lamp, as far as I know. But you can use a tub of ice with a fan over it to blow cold air at people. And I've actually seen it been done where people have used ultrasound, the exact same hardware as I just showed you, to focus that cold air so it's blowing at a very small area on the skin, again about a centimetre diameter. So there's also one more option, which is self-feedback. So if I pinch, I can feel when my fingers are meeting. I'm actually getting resistive feedback, vibrotactile, and probably thermal feedback as well at the same time, which is great. Because some haptics is better than no haptics. And haptics is the reason why pinch is such a good gesture. It's the reason why Facebook have chosen to use it so much. Unfortunately, it only tells me that I have pinched. It doesn't tell me that the system has recognized that I have pinched. So it's kind of useful, but it's not actually giving you the feedback that you need to know if the computer has recognized what you intend to do. So it's all right, but yeah, it'll do in a pinch. So hopefully I've kind of convinced you that spatial interaction in XR is cool and worthwhile doing, and you know everything you need to get started, and I hope you will. I think that this is an area that we're going to see developing a lot fairly quickly. XR, well, VR in particular, is starting to come out of the trough of disillusionment and starting to gain broader adoption. I think that there have been rumors that we've seen that Apple are developing an AR headset. I think it's probably likely at this point that we will see technology like this maybe replacing smartphones or certainly enhancing them. So it's definitely a good thing to be getting into at this point. And I hope you will. I hope you make great things. Got some useful resources here, and the recruitment team would kill me if I didn't mention we're hiring. So there's a link at the bottom there, or you can get in touch with me. So yeah, thank you for listening, and I think there's some time for some questions.
Cool. Cool, so we've got lots of time for questions. We just need to ask the questions on the mic, so just wait until you get given the mic to answer a question. So who wants to ask the first question?
Hello, yes, so quick question about the Leap Motion on the headset. All the pictures had a cable on it. Is that still something you're working on?
Yep. It's the strategy is more to embed the hardware into the headset itself rather than having to stick it on. It's an interim solution. As I said, a lot of headsets are starting to come out with hand tracking in, and some of them, is our hand tracking. So yeah, I think that's the trend. But for getting started right now, you sometimes still need to use a peripheral.
If you wanted to mess around with this stuff, how good of a PC do you need? Like, assume very.
Yeah, so the hand tracking itself adds a bit of an overhead, but obviously if you're using VR, look at the minimum specs that are out there. Although it's been around for a few years now, so the GPUs that you needed at the early days can still handle it. So like I think 970, GTX 970, I don't know what the equivalent AMD card is. That was what they were recommending back in 2016, and that's obviously a lot cheaper these days. So you do need a reasonable graphics card and a reasonable CPU, but it's not as expensive as it used to be.
Hi. I just wondered, I had two questions actually. In terms of getting feedback, has anybody been looking into just injecting sort of electrical signals into the nerves up to the brain rather than actually sort of internal stimulation of the? Is that something that's being looked at?
Yes. There's a company called Neuralink, which I think is Elon Musk's. They are trying to just do a complete brain-computer interface. At that point, you don't even need a VR headset. There's also, I think, a company that are making wristbands, which I think does like small electric shocks into the nerves there. We've actually experimented with not that, but something similar ourselves, where a university did it for us. They dropped pins into the arm to try and read the nerve signals that were coming from our haptics. And I can tell you from working on that study, we are a long way off.
The other question I had is, we were talking a lot about hand tracking. What about legs and feet tracking? I imagine like a football computer game, VR.
Yeah. So body tracking is a lot more advanced than hand tracking, actually. The Microsoft Kinect, has had it for years. And they've just released a new one, actually, called the Azure Kinect, which is more of a dev kit. And we've been experimenting with that internally, and it is pretty good. For XR, it's a bit more difficult because if the only sensor you've got is on your head, it's harder to know what the rest of your body is doing. You can try and have cameras kind of pointing outwards, and I'm sure we will start to see some of that. We've also seen people attaching trackers to like their feet. If you've got a kind of like Vive system where you've got the outside-in tracking. So yeah, definitely it's something which is, I think, coming along.
Do you know if anyone has created any systems for text entry using only hand gestures?
Yes. Yes, they have. So there's a whole range here, and something I really want to do is try and make a single best one. So we've seen ones where they just lay out a keyboard, and you just kind of press the buttons. They still have to be fairly big because the accuracy of the fingers is still not sort of down to millimeter level. We've seen ones where people are using gestures. We've seen ones where you sort of project like a laser pointer out the hand and use it to kind of point at letters, maybe with a gesture to choose a letter, or even just in a kind of swipe-based interaction. We've seen ones where they have sort of abandoned QWERTY entirely and have just sort of laid out all the letters in a sort of flat way where they sort of use, there's one I've seen which has sort of 3 letters kind of stacked together, and I guess it uses prediction to figure out which you want. So there's like 10 stacks, and you can use each of your fingers to press them. There's a lot of experimentation going on with that, and I think we're still reaching a point where we'll actually find the best way of doing that.
We raise your hand, yeah.
This kind of follows on from the body tracking thing. So you're talking about occlusion from hands and other objects when you've got like a leap motion facing out from a VR headset. It's kind of a twofold question. With kind of sensor fusion from like an external Kinect, I imagine you can combine those data points and kind of fill in some of the gaps. Do you know if the Chronos OpenXR kind of specification fills in any gaps there to actually allow cross-vendor sensor fusion for setups like that?
That's an interesting question. I think the extension won't specify how the hand tracking is done. It's just an API to access the data. So if you wanted to do sensor fusion, you could do that underneath and then provide the data via the OpenXR API.
Okay. But that then requires, I guess, some collaboration between the people making the sensors.
Yeah. Which we are obviously collaborating as part of the working group. But yeah, at that level, I'm not sure. I mean, also the thing is, you could take, for instance, Kinect body tracking and some kind of hand tracking, and then just stitch the hands on at the ends of the arms, because the Kinect doesn't really track the hands that well. It sort of gives you, I think, 3 points on the hand versus the 26 that most hand trackers give. So it's not really sensor fusion, but it would still give you a kind of more complete picture of the body.
About both leap motion and Ultrahaptics, do you see any implementations coming for mobile devices in the future, if you can speak of it?
Ultrahaptics, not particularly soon. It's still too big. We're making it smaller, but take a few years. For Leap, watch this space.
How much of an effect does audio have on the tactile experience?
Big. Multimodality is huge. Audio and visual have an effect on haptics and vice versa, and it is actually a massive effect. We've got an experience where you're in VR and your hands kind of get set on fire, and we apply some haptics. And people come out and they ask us, how did you make our hands feel hot? And there's also kind of burning sounds as well. And the answer is we don't. It's just an illusion because the visuals and the audio combine with the haptics and make you believe that your hands are hot. So yeah, audio and visuals and haptics, they just combine to make a completely different experience than the one that your body might actually be experiencing. So yeah, it's huge.
Awesome. We've got one more question, I think, and then we'll finish up.
I can imagine some really good applications in sort of the world of sort of gaming for this technology. But other than gaming, what do you see the main applications of the sort of people who think this could transform their businesses? I just wondered if you had a view on what they were.
Yeah, I think virtual reality is mostly going to be used for entertainment, but augmented reality or mixed reality is not. So I think, like I mentioned, kind of it replacing smartphones, I think that's maybe a bit further out. In the more immediate term, we've seen Microsoft focusing on first-line workers, so like factory workers, for instance, assembly lines, warehouses, and I think that will start to expand from there, and we'll see in offices, particularly things like data and analytics, being visualized in 3D is going to be much better than on a graph on a screen. So that can be quite a big one. In terms of communication, feeling like you're actually talking to someone, like there's actually someone there, and it's not just a kind of face on a screen, is huge. So I think we'll start to see video conferencing and teleconferencing become kind of reality conferencing, maybe. So that's going to be a big one. Training is another one. If I want to train someone to do something and I can actually put them in the place they're going to be and get them to see and hear what they will actually be seeing and hearing, then they're going to be able to pick things up much quicker than if they're kind of watching a video. I could probably go on. I think it's going to impact a lot of different areas.
Cool, that's awesome. Thank you very much. Have a round of applause for Adam, please.